welcome to Up Close with Carlos Sang, celebrating art, entertainment, and the human spirit. Welcome to another episode of Up Close with Carlos Sang. My next guest is one of my favourite West End performers. He has previously been seen in productions of Little Shop of Horrors, Lend Me a Tenor, Company, and is now currently starring in Stephen Sondheim's Old Friends on the West End. It's a huge delight to be able to introduce the one and only Damian Humbley. Thank you so much for joining us.
Not at all, Carlos. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Old Friends, it was one of my theatrical highlights of last year, and it's great to see it's come back now and have you attached to. How much would you say the show has changed as well since last year?
Well, I think there's a few things in that it's they've got more time to prepare. I think with the concert, it was very getting everyone together at the same time was they only had a couple of days, I think, by the time the entire cast got there. So we've had a few weeks to rehearse this one, which has been quite beneficial. Because I think the amount of time that you can give Steve's material, it can only serve it better, you know. I also think because there's less people involved as well, it's more of a streamlined show. I think there's a lovely structure to it, and I think it kind of gives a nice version of the best bits of a love letter to Steve, which I think we can all agree turns out pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because it's often pointed out that Sondheim's work has never been particularly commercial, and now, yeah, we've got this big show dedicated to his work on the West End. With Sondheim now also gone, do you think Sondheim will become more commercial, going forwards?
Well, I can only hope. I think that there hasn't been a writer like him, and I think there's not bound to be one like him anytime soon. I think he was very special in the way that he wrote, and it would be, I guess, if you look back to the times of, I compare him to, and a lot of people compare him to Shakespeare in the way that he was, he perfectly wrote from, like Shakespeare, from prose to verse. He perfectly wrote from that transition from text and dialogue into lyrics and music. And I think at the time Shakespeare was a thing, but I think it's certainly much bigger now. I can only hope that that's the same of Steve's work. And I think what this show does, like you say, it's never been commercial in that way, but I think what this show does in by making it a review type show of giving zero context really of where things come from. You have a slight sense of Into the Woods starting, but you don't really know all the characters in it. And I think by the way this show's been set up is that it's all been taken out of context, these different parts. But because of that, we've been able to present his work in a very special and unique way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely remember feeling there was a great sense of loss when Stephen Sondheim passed away a few years ago.
Mm.
Why do you think his work is still, so revered in the industry?
Well, from a personal point of view, he really taught me through his work, acting through song. He taught me, like I say, is that he was able to perfectly negotiate that transition from dialogue in musicals to the stakes getting so heightened that you can no longer speak, but you have to sing it out. And he did that beautifully. So in a way, he's a teacher of how to approach any sort of music theater. And I think that that's certainly a big part for me is that I approach everyone's work with the same technique that I would approach Steve's work, the technique that he taught me through his work.
Yeah, I mean, I first came across you in A Little Nice Music at Holland Park, one of my favorite
Yeah.
Sondheim musicals. Yeah, I mean, how has it been, getting to work with Joanna Riding and Janie D again, on Old Friends?
Yeah, they're great fun. They're great fun. They've all got their wonderful idiosyncrasies and they're a joy to work with in every way. I think, I mean, you take Joe in, we did that Holland Park concert. What was that? A couple of years ago now, I think. Joe was playing the Countess in that, and she's doing Not Getting Married Today, which we've all seen dozens of versions of that song, and I think she does a very unique telling of it. Like I say, with the out of context idea, is that with Not Getting Married Today, in the frame of the show Company, we understand who Paul is to a degree. We understand who Amy is, these characters that Joe and I play in that song. we understand them to a degree because we've had a whole show of getting to know them to a certain extent. But with this, it's out of context. So you immediately set up these archetypes of who these people are and why does she not want to get married to him. So you can recognize him as an audience within a split second of like, he's a bit of a this kind of guy, and she's obviously scared of being locked into a lifetime relationship with him. And so the song can progress from there without any sort of history. And I think that this version's unique because of that. And Joe brings that essence of out of context archetypal fear to it, which I think is a very special thing. You touch on something very special, I think, about this show, in that you've got these incredible performers like Janie D, like Joe Riding, like Bonnie Langford, like in their own right are leading West End theatrical powerhouses. And then you've got Bernadette Peters, then you've got Lea Salonga, you've got Bradley Jane, you've got all these people that Jeremy Seckham that play these extraordinary leading power parts in the West End and have for decades, and we're all in one show. It's quite a unique experience.
Yeah, it's definitely really unique in that regard. I agree. It really feels like a group of Sondheim's old friends, quite literally. But this year, you've also got a lot of younger performers too. How has it been, coming together, bringing all these different generations of performers together for this show?
Well, I think that Steve's work is very much universal in that you look at a show like Merrily, whether you're starting at the beginning, which is the end of their relationship, at a certain age, and then you end the show with these young, fresh out of college, wanting to change the world. It's everywhere in between. It's all accessible. And I think that everyone in this cast, especially with the young guys and girls that have come out of drum school, are very eager to learn and to understand and to glean what they can and contribute what they can to it, as his material lends itself to. Everyone is an absolute pleasure to work with, and everyone brings their A game. Everyone wants to pay respect and reverence to this man's great work.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Merrily, and of course, you worked very closely with Sondheim at the Money Chocolate Factory on that production. What
Mm.
memories do you have of working with Sondheim too yourself?
Well, we he only came in a few times actually in that particular show. He came at certain. It was, I think, it was on purpose as well. As it came at certain points of the process to be able to chime in, and he, I don't think, wanted to be particularly present throughout it all because wanted to, give it space to breathe and for us all to find it in a way. But it was. I think I said in an interview back then. It's especially when I said to you that back at university, he was kind of my gateway to understanding music theatre as a whole. There's something about when you meet your theatrical god in that way, is that it's a very unique experience, and he had very, very kind words to say to us about what he thought about that production and how he felt that um, it had hit the spot and had finally worked in that way. And I think he said, if I remember correctly, he only wished George was here to see it.
Mm.
George, the writer.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Merrily has had such a complicated history over the years.
Mm.
What was it, that drew you to that show and to the role of Charley too back then?
Well, funnily enough, I back at university, we did a production of Merrily, and I wanted to play Charlie so bad, but they didn't cast me as it. And so I had that character just gestating in the back of my mind for, oh gosh, it must have been well over a decade and a bit. And and I've always wanted to play it. So just as fortune had it, I'd worked at the Chocolate Factory a few times, and they knew my work and wanted to see me for it, and it seemed pretty destined the way it all kind of happened. And the great thing was that we did that production at the Chocolate Factory. Then we went to the Pinter in town, and then a glorious thing happened. Is about 6 years later, Mark Umbers and myself did it in Boston, and we did it with instead of playing part of Mary, it was Eden Espinosa that came and joined us in Boston. And there was something about, again, that after we'd done it the first time, this character and these relationships gestating, they just sit there, they kind of like wine, they just ferment, you know. And when we got to Boston, Mark and I had already had quite a long, in-depth friendship because we'd done it back in London, and then Eden joined us, and so it was very much this kind of dynamic of Frank, Charley, and Mary that joined together. So it's a role that I don't think since my college days has ever kind of left me. So what attracted me to it? Everything. I think he's a wonderful character in the way that it's in that one line where he says, "Do the work and the money will come." He's all about creating the art. He's all about let's put our all into everything and see what happens, as opposed to let's compromise and go from those angles. Let's make great art. And
Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful analogy to Steve's stuff, is that as commercial as this show is, the review show that is Old Friends, it's to get his work out there even more. But I think he was always about making the art, and it was always that inner conflict, isn't it? You see it all through his work about, especially in Merrily, you see it all about the sellout versus the artist, and where how they negotiate in a capitalist society and how they function.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Merrily is now also playing Broadway as well. You know, Maria Friedman's taking that production over there. Has it been strange, you know, seeing all the publicity for that, you know, having previously been involved with it yourself?
No, not really. I think that the great thing about any good art is that it's with you for a bit and then it moves on. You know, I don't think these kind of ownership of roles, I don't think are particularly warranted, because it's for everyone. You know, I remember reading an interview actually with George Lucas about Star Wars, and do you remember when they changed he changed it and made these kind of special editions and brought in CGI uh, from different parts of his other films just to kind of enhance them in some sort of way. And there was an uproar, and fans were like, "But it's not the originals," and he couldn't understand it. But the point is that when you put art into the world, it doesn't belong to you anymore; it belongs to everyone. And I think that, you know, it's the same with Merrily, is that it's roles are with you for a certain time, and then they, you know, you hold their torch and you play the truth of them as while you have them, and then you let them go like anything. And I remember actually, I remember Daniel Radcliffe coming to see our production at the Pinter, and we had a chat afterwards, and he said this thing to me. He said, "Oh, your song, Franklin Shepherd Inc., the way it went from this and it became something else and then grew into something. It was like a magic trick." And I remember thinking to myself that Harry Potter just said that I did a magic trick, and that's pretty awesome.
That's yeah, that's very, very cool. I mean, yeah, also coming back to A Little Night Music as well in Holland Park, you know, obviously that was, you know,
Yeah.
one night only sort of concert. You know, there was only I think
Mm.
200 of us in the audience. How
Yeah,
much
and
did
you were
you
very wet by the end of it, I seem to
We
recall.
were, I remember that very clearly. Yeah, how much did you feel like you were able to, you know, explore the character of Frederick as well, you know, given that was only for one night only?
Yeah, I mean, I think we rehearsed for that concert about a week leading up to it. You know, together. We'd all done our individual prep. But it's, you know, it's definitely a role that I'd like to touch on in the future. I think it's a beautiful show. I think it's extraordinary. And it was very fun to do. It was. I'd like to have another crack at it as well, because also you're in a concert version, so there's only so much that you can do with it, you know. And I remember a very specific moment when I think Nadim, who was playing the Count, was singing his that song, "She Wouldn't, Therefore She Couldn't," and that number I can't remember the title, but he was doing that, and it was at that second that the heavens opened up, and I remember looking out, and the entire audience were reaching into their bags to get their umbrellas, or reaching into their bags to get their coats, or rainproof garments, and he just kept singing the song. And I remember admiring him, going, he wasn't flummoxed at all by this wave of audience just moving and not so much paying attention to what he was saying, but more attention to the fact that they were getting drenched very quickly.
Yeah, would you want to perform in the rain again as well, or is that you've kind of done that
Well,
too?
we were very lucky. I don't know if you remember, we had a canopy above us,
Mm.
which I think the sound department were very happy about, because it meant that our very expensive microphones didn't get wet. But I also recall watching the sound department's face when Janie D stepped out into the rain to sing "Send in the Clowns." I think she stepped out on "Isn't It Bliss," and looking at the production desk, they were like, "No."
Yeah, I remember you also did Company as well in Sheffield, another great
Yeah, that's right.
Sondheim show. And I didn't realize that was the same show with Rosalie Craig as well, who obviously went on to do Bobby in the West End.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we
Yeah,
had similar to this. We had a lot of great people that were, in their own right, leading players that we did a production out in Sheffield.
yeah.
And Dan Evans was Bobby, and Francesca Annis was in it. Rosalie Craig, myself, Kelly Price, AJ Casey. Like, yeah, there was a list of people. Sam Spiro played Amy in it.
Mm.
Yeah, it was a great show.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. How was it, taking that show over to Sheffield as well? I feel like that's got, such a great theatre too. Was that experience, what you were sort of expecting too?
I mean, it was interesting because it was around Christmas, wasn't it? And Christmas in this country is normally panto sort of season. And I remember Dan Evans was running Sheffield at the time, and he'd programmed the theatre in such a way that I think it had three spaces, and over in the Lyceum was a big kind of Christmas show, which was, I think, the panto, and there was another sort of family show that was in the studio. So I felt that he could. Uh, I think he felt that he could bring Sondheim into the crucible and get away with it. And I think it was successful, if memory serves me. It was a great production. We had a lot of great people working on it, and I think company can be quite because it's non-linear nature in the way that it tells the story, can be quite inaccessible to some people. But I seem to recall the audience reactions being very much for the affirmative, very much enjoying it. And we enjoyed it. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you, it was cold. Sheffield at Christmas was cold.
Yes, I can definitely imagine. I mean, you've played some great Sondheim parts, Frederick in Little Night Music, Harry in Company,
Mm.
Charlie in Merrily. Are there any other Sondheim roles that you'd like to play going forwards?
Oh man, I'd like to play them all. But there's this thing that limits us as actors, and it's age. So, I mean, the great thing about this particular show, Old Friends, is that I'm playing one of the princes, which I think I'm probably aged out of in an actual production of Into the Woods. But it's quite fun to have a crack at that in this show. Yeah, I'd like to throw my hat in the ring for all of them, really. But it's also about, I think you can't have too many productions of, say, Sunday in the Park with George running every year. You know what I mean? You can, or Little Night Music. There was a very successful production that the Chocolate Factory did that went to Broadway a few years back. So maybe it's time for another production of A Little Night Music.
Mm.
But in the same way of, there's been quite a few successful productions of Sunday in the Park with George in recent times. And I think that Jake Gyllenhaal one was going to come over, but then the pandemic hit and
Yes.
all that. So I think yeah, I'd like to. Why limit myself with just a few of them? I tell you what, when it comes to his work, when someone calls about it, you certainly take the call and answer it and jump up to the opportunity. There's a lot of things that are out there where uh, that have a up and down idea of interest. That someone suggests something, you're like, yeah, it's not really for me. But if it's a Sondheim, I'll always jump at the chance. I think he's a genius, and
Yeah.
his what to me music theatre should be the baseline of,
Yeah.
which
It's
I'm sure you can agree. Like his work is extraordinary.
absolutely. It's very, very special work. I mean, you've been working, in the West End for, the best part of 20 years now yourself. How would you say, the
Thanks
landscape
for reminding me. I had a
has...
slight heart attack then.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, how would you say the landscape has changed, since you began?
Oh wow, what a question. Well, when I first got here, I did a production of Woman in White at the Palace Theatre, and we was actually having this conversation a couple of nights back about uh, the way the way shows are in the West End at the moment. Is that I think in that production we ran. I was on the second cast, and we still ran for like 10 or 12 months, and then I did a small thing at the Chocolate Factory, a production of the last 5 years. and then came back into town. No, then I went to Sheffield and did Fiddler on the Roof, which then came into town, and that ran for about a year. I guess why I'm saying that is that back then shows would run for a good solid length of time, but nowadays it seems to be very much the 12-week sort of period or the 16-week period that shows generally don't run unless they're those already established glorious productions of like Phantom of the Opera or Les Miserables, those almost staples to the West End. You know, you come to the West End and these productions are running. Any sort of new show, they tend to be only about 3 months or maybe a little bit more, like Bake Off, the same.
Yeah.
So I think the landscape for music theatre or shows generally has very much changed in regards to that. Is that it used to be I remember I did a production of Lend Me a Tenor. That was the last time I was at the Gielgud, actually, a production of Lend Me a Tenor, the musical.
Ah,
And our idea was that, you know, we would run, and this was very a pinnacle to this conversation, is that the idea was that we would run for at least 6 months, I think. I think we might have had the theatre for at least 6 months, but that show only lasted 7 weeks. And I think it's very interesting to look at that landscape and go, what's changed that especially new shows can't support that length of time anymore. It seems to be that things start and maybe it's a launch ground to go on tour or to take it further around the country. Because you know there is a very much an economical question of an audience member who's, say, coming from outside of London. When they come in, they're talking about travel, they're talking about uh, dinner, lunch, maybe a couple of shows, even accommodation, depending on where they live. They might want to come down for the weekend, and that's without ticket prices. So I think that when families do that, they want to be guaranteed that they're coming to see a show of quality. And if it's a new production of things, I don't think it hasn't got the history of people understanding that quality, you know. Whereas with Les Miserables and Phantom of the Opera, they know exactly what they're going to get. They're going to get this quality of show that they know that they're going to get. Whereas with something like, say, Bake Off or something like even Old Friends, you know, they're unsure as to what they might get.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting how you mentioned Lend Me a Tenor as well, because didn't you also do like a workshop premiere in like Plymouth as well before you?
Yeah, that's right. We
Yeah.
did. We workshopped that. I think originally around like March
Yeah.
one year, and then I think later on that year we went out of town and did it in Plymouth. And I think we only ran like 2 weeks. It was definitely like Plymouth has this wonderful facility of being able to support a new production in the way that we even rehearsed on the set. Their rehearsal room is massive, and they've got the costume making facilities nearby, all in this one building. They build a set on in the same building, and then we take it to the Theatre Royal, which is down the road from them, and we ran there for 2 weeks. And the idea of having a bigger production that we then bring into town, and then I think it came into town about 5 months later.
Yeah, yeah. Was the experience on Bake Off quite similar too when you were in Cheltenham before coming into London?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's the way. I mean, that's the old school way of doing shows, and I quite like that way. Is that you know, you go out into a place where you can make changes, where you can really understand how the best way to put this piece on, and the best way to tell this story, and what parts are working, and what parts aren't, without having West End theatre reviewers or Broadway theatre reviewers or anyone kind of judging it and putting their words down in paper or online about the quality of production before it's ready. So you get a tryout audience, and that's the way that they used to do musicals, and that's the way I think we should still do them. You know, I think the idea of doing something and not workshopping it enough or not trying it out enough before you put it on stage. You know, there's a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of people's hard work that goes into these productions before you even see it on stage, before you even get to a rehearsal room. That I think it's important to get it right, and by ignoring that and bringing it straight into town to try and I don't know make cash or try and get it out there uh, before it's ready, I think it does it a disservice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with Bake Off as well, it was such an it was such an unusual idea. I wasn't really sure what to expect going into it.
Yeah.
what was it that drew you to that part as well, and to that show?
Well, it's funny you say that, you know. It was just after the pandemic, and I was similar. It came to me and I was like, "Really? Bake Off the musical?" And I went in for a 3-day kind of workshop about it, and it was after those 3 days with the script that was given, the ideas that we were exploring, I found it really fascinating, and I thought that there's definitely a story to be told here, and something very important, especially coming out of a pandemic, an idea of community, an idea of sharing, and an idea of being together, whether it be through baking, whether it be going to see the theater, whether it be sport, whether it be everything in between these community activities. Especially coming out of the pandemic when we couldn't have them anymore, we could only do them online. I think there was a very important story that was being told, so it definitely wooed me in that way. But I think that you've hit something on the head there, is that when you get that experience and you go and see it and you experience it, I think that you understand it. You go, of course, this is a beautiful show. But until you do that, and what we were talking about with the audiences coming from out of town, or audiences making a journey into London to see a show, if that's the feeling or the response of, oh, Bake Off the musical, you're not going to buy a ticket necessarily to that. You're going to buy a ticket to something that you are guaranteed, yeah, let's go see this. And I think that there was, certainly in retrospect in town, there was definitely a feeling of that. There was not a day that went by where I didn't pass the front of the theater and hear someone say something like, Bake Off the musical, wow, they'll make anything into a musical nowadays, and they just keep walking.
Mm.
Whereas we had standing ovations every single night because it was a beautiful show. But I think you've definitely tapped into something important there that leads on from your previous question about what's the landscape that's changed, in that it's no longer about necessarily the quality of work, which I think is very important, but it's how you get them into the theatre to experience that quality of work.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Um,
interesting how you say that as well, because we also talked about how in order for something to be commercially successful, it needs to be something that's already established. And Bake Off is one of the most popular shows in the country right now.
yeah,
So,
but whether or not it lends itself to be a musical in someone's mind
mm,
is a very different thing.
yeah, yeah, you are right. And I guess with Lend Me a Tenor, it's the complete opposite of Bake Off. It's not really based on something super well established, and it's been a good 10 years since that show opened and closed. Do you see a future life for that show too?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I'm a particularly good. I think it was a beautiful show. I think it was a wonderful show. Don't get me wrong. I think it was a very extraordinary piece of theatre. Um, and everyone that came and saw it in those weeks that we were open absolutely loved it. I mean, I still hear from people that say, "Oh my God, I love that show." Um, but whether or not it has a future in it, I think it, you can never take it out of the context of that we live in a capitalist world, and for something to work, it has to make money because it has to be able to support itself. There's a lot of people that need to get paid for a show to go on, and that's not just on stage. There's so much work that goes behind the scenes, that the magic and the illusion of it is that you don't see that. All you see is what you get when you sit down as an audience member, and the illusion that's cast from that. But there is so much work and so many people that work on a show uh, that need to, be financially sustained. So I think that, does a show have legs, or does it have a future life? It all depends on the context of, can it make any money in a commercial world?
Yeah, I mean, when you receive a script now, do you normally have an idea of, how successful it will be, or, is it always a surprise to you?
Yeah, I think that's it's something that I've grown to learn. Yeah, I've grown to understand, and I've learned. I was very much about the artistry before, isolated from the idea of success. I would always be field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you create great work, like Charley in Merrily, if you do the work, the money will come. If you create great art, if you put your all into something and you make something beautiful and something moving and something that captures the imagination, then it will support itself. As I've gotten older, I've also understood that cannot exist outside of a world irrelevant or without respect of a commercial world. In that you can make a wonderful piece of theatre, but if no one's going to see it, you could almost go, "What's the point of putting it on?" So it's not. I don't think it's a trade-off. Like if you look at something like Merrily, you've got Frank Shepherd, who's the other side of the thing, who's about let's make money and we'll put the art off, and their show Take a Left takes a break for year after year after year. I don't think it's one instead of the other. I just think that you can't ignore the commercial side of things, especially in this day and age where people are struggling financially, and if you're asking them to part with money that they've earned, that they've taken time away from their families to earn, I think that you need to be able to get them to trust you that it's a good amount of money to spend on something. So I think as I've gotten older, I do look at something and go, of course, firstly, is it artistically relevant? Is it something that will move? Is it something that will capture people's imaginations? Is it something that will entertain? But then secondly, is it also something that will sell? Is it something that can sustain itself?
Yeah, I mean, looking over your career as well, you've done, these, great Sondheim parts. You did stuff like Lend Me a Tenor and Bake Off, but you've not really done any of those, long running shows, as we said, things like
Mm.
Les Mis or Phantom. Was that a conscious decision as well, when you've been selecting parts too?
I'd like to say it was, but I think there's a certain amount of control that an actor doesn't have over their career, as much as they might want to pretend there is. So I would like to say that there has been a conscious choice, and at times there was very much a conscious choice of, I don't really want to be seen for that sort of stuff or go in for that sort of stuff, because I, I still think uh, I still feel creative, and I still feel like, a lot of these shows that you're talking about, I workshopped from the very beginning. So there's a certain amount of creativity that I like to be a part of. Um, but uh, I don't necessarily think that a lot of it's been in my hands in that way. Um, but I'm also very happy with the way it's turned out.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been so wonderful talking to you. Just as a last question, what would you say is the
Yeah.
best part about being Damian Humbley?
What's the best part about being Damian Humbley? The best part. I have an awesome wife and an awesome dog and an awesome life, and it makes me very happy in that way. And I'm very glad that I'm able to live a life. I'm like you say, 20 years ago I came to this country, and I'm still working as an actor. So that's a very lucky thing. And I also get to have the opportunity to talk with fine people like you, Carlos. So these are all the things that make up the best part of being Damien Humbley.
Damian Humbley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.